How often do outliers happen, Errol? Outliers, by their nature, are events that statistically do not occur very often. But if I were to, and I know you know the numbers now, we're going to get into standard deviations and kind of defining an outlier, and then see in crude oil how often they happen and what you might expect after an outlier. Mm-hmm. But from your just like general point of view, if I were to say percentage points from 0 to 100, what makes an outlier for you? Something that occurs 20% of the time, 10% of the time? What are you thinking?
Right off the bat in my head, an outlier might be what? Yeah, I would say maybe 20%. If it happens 20% of the time, I'm like, oh, that's an outlier move.
Cool. Yeah.
Without knowing the numbers, which I know them now, but if you were to just ask me straight up.
For sure. And the nice thing is that like outliers can be defined as anything for anyone, right? Like we've got, and the three standard deviations, the standard deviation in general really creates a nice guideline for everybody where it's like, okay, one standard deviation is saying that the market stays in this range 68% of the time. So it's outside 32% of the time. So by Errol's definition, not really an outlier. Two standard deviations is saying, okay, this is where the market stays 95% of the time. So it's outside 5%, only 5% of the time. That'd be kind of an outlier for you. Now, if you're even more conservative in what you would call an outlier, you'd say, okay, well, three standard deviations, 99, actually even more than that. It's like 99.5% of the time the market is in this range. And so only about 1% of the time you're getting a three standard deviation move. That should, at that point, hopefully that dings that kind of like, this is an outlier, but it can be whatever it is to different people.
Yeah, agreed.
And so with that in mind, what we saw yesterday was an outlier move in crude oil. We saw the market down more than three standard deviations to the downside. And I spoke to you about how I crunched the numbers, and a $15 move lower in crude oil that we saw yesterday is the biggest move that I have data for. And I have data going back more than 2 decades. So one of the biggest moves we've ever seen in crude oil yesterday. And that begged the question, like, what happens after an outlier? Now you have kind of how often they might occur. And that, is relative to what you think. I think 1% of the time is maybe a good spot to call that an outlier. When we see that 1% of the time move, what happens the day after? You want to try to guess what the answer is there?
What happens the day after of a one standard deviation move?
So if I told you, no, 3 standard deviations, huge, rare move. If I told you, Errol, crude oil is down, the biggest outlier move to the downside we've ever seen, what do you think is going to happen tomorrow?
I would think at least a little bit of an up move. In my head, I'd be like, no way it could go even further.
The funny thing is, yeah, you're exactly right. And that's not funny because Errol's a super smart dude and he's right all the time. But the funny thing was, I monitored 3 standard deviation moves in crude oil, both to the up and downside.
Okay.
And actually the day after both outliers to the downside, there was a positive reaction the next day on average. Outliers to the upside in crude, there was a positive reaction the day after, which I thought was pretty interesting there, that the upside trend was in both directions. Obviously for us, it's more relevant, that big downside move being yesterday, that, yeah, crude oil did tend to bounce back the next day. But what was funny as well, Errol, is, and I didn't ask you this, but the magnitude of the bounce back wasn't that big, actually. The average move in crude after a 3 standard deviation move was inside of 1 standard deviation. So okay. I think a lot of people might think, yeah, right, because volatility clustering, I think a lot of people might think big outlier move, there's going to be an outlier move the next day, right?
Yeah, at least a 2 standard deviation, not barely a 1.
Yeah. Absolutely. It was funny. I crunched, and obviously there's only a handful of numbers, because here's the thing, Errol's question that spurred this conversation, which is, how often do outliers occur? Well, if you're gauging them as 3 standard deviation moves, which occur about 1% of the time, then in the last 2 decades, if you crunch all the numbers like I did, there should be only about 30 or so occurrences of these outliers. And I looked, my man, and it was about 40 occurrences. So kind of right in the wheelhouse, a little bit more than we would expect. But the probabilities, they do pan out. If you think an outlier is 1% of the time, 3 standard deviation move, you're only going to get that move 1 or 2 days a year. We got it yesterday. And what we saw afterwards, on average, the 40 times in the last 2 decades was an inside day, but an average positive day. A lot of cool information there, right?
Yeah. Like if someone were to just wait for a 3 standard deviation move, and after you crunch those numbers on how much maybe that bounce would be after a 3 standard deviation move, and it happens 1 or 2 times a year, is it even worth just waiting and sitting on my hands for a 3 standard deviation move for that type of reward?
I would say it's not worth waiting because you just get so few occurrences. Yeah. But I like to think of it as like, that's a nice little tool to have in your back pocket for when you see, crude oil make that move, which is going to happen once or twice a year. You have it in your back pocket now for the next time around. And so we'll see where crude oil does close today. We just bought the market because it is now down after yesterday's outlier move. Yeah. I don't know where it's going to close, but the data has historically said, the 40 times or so in the last 2 decades that we've seen an average move higher. And that's how often outliers happen. And also what the market tends to do afterwards, Errol.